The rain came first, not the gentle kind that whispers through leaves, but the suffocating deluge that turned everything in the Pacific jungle into a fever dream of green darkness and rotting earth. It was October 1944, on an island whose name would be redacted from official reports for decades, a volcanic scar in the Philippine Sea where the jungle grew so thick that sunlight never reached the forest floor, where every breath tasted like decay, and where Private First Class James Jimmy Castellano of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, was about to become a ghost. The patrol had been routine until it wasn't. 13 men moving single file through elephant grass taller than their heads, weapons at the ready, eyes scanning the impossible tangle of vines and shadows for any sign of the enemy they knew was watching. The Japanese had been pulling back for days, leaving behind tripwires and booby traps, spider holes, and cunningly concealed bunkers, a trail of silent violence that made every step a gamble with death. Lieutenant Morrison had the point, moving with the careful grace of a man who'd survived Guadalcanal and Tarawa, who knew that the jungle itself was the enemy, that it hid everything and revealed nothing until it was far too late. Castellano was near the rear of the column, his bar heavy across his chest, the weight of it familiar now after months of carrying it through hell. 20 pounds of wood and steel that could spit out 600 rounds per minute, that had saved his life more times than he could count, that made him valuable and made him a target all at once. He was 22 years old, but looked 40 in the right light, his face gaunt and stubbled, his utilities hanging loose on a frame that had shed 30 pounds since landing on these godforsaken shores. The rain had soaked through everything hours ago. His feet were rotting inside his boondockers, the flesh white and swollen, the beginning stages of immersion foot that would cripple half the battalion before winter came. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today's problem was staying alive long enough to see tomorrow. The ambush came from 3 sides at once, a perfectly executed L-shaped kill zone that would have impressed any instructor at Quantico. The first shots tore through Morrison, spinning him sideways into the grass where he disappeared, and then the jungle erupted with muzzle flashes and the distinctive crack of Arisaka rifles, the stutter of Nambu machine guns, the screaming. Castellano hit the dirt on pure instinct, the bar already coming up, his finger finding the trigger as shapes moved in the smoke and shadows. The world compressed into a tunnel of sound and motion, training taking over where thought ended. He fired in controlled bursts, sweeping left to right, hearing the bar's distinctive roar cut through the chaos, seeing tracers arc into the vegetation. Someone was screaming for a corpseman. Someone else was returning fire with an M1, the sharp crack of Garand rounds punctuating the heavier rattle of automatic weapons. The ambush lasted maybe 90 seconds. It felt like hours. When the firing stopped, Castellano found himself 20 yards from where he'd started, separated from the column by a wall of jungle and smoke, his ears ringing so badly he couldn't hear his own breathing. He'd gone through 2 magazines, 40 rounds of 30-06 that had disappeared into the green darkness without visible effect. The enemy had pulled back into the jungle the way they always did, vanishing like smoke, leaving only silence and the smell of cordite and torn vegetation. He stayed frozen for a full minute, listening, waiting for the follow-up attack that doctrine said would come, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his teeth. Morrison! His voice sounded strange, muffled by the rain and the ringing in his ears. Chapman. Anybody. Nothing. The rain answered, hammering down harder now, turning the ground beneath him in his soup. He rose slowly, the bar leading, every nerve screaming that he was about to get shot, that there was a sniper out there with him in the crosshairs, that the next breath would be his last. But no shots came. He moved toward where the column should be, stepping carefully, avoiding the obvious paths, the way they'd taught him at Camp Pendleton a lifetime ago. He found Chapman 30 feet away, face down in the mud, the back of his dungaree jacket shredded and dark with blood that the rain was washing away in pink streams. Castellano didn't need to check for a pulse. You learned to recognize death quickly out here. It had a stillness that sleep never did. He found Morrison next, or what was left of him, draped over a fallen log like discarded laundry. 3 others were scattered in a rough line, cut down in the first seconds of the ambush before they could even turn a fight. The rest of the patrol was gone. Whether they'd pulled back, whether they'd been captured, whether they'd scattered into the jungle to regroup, Castellano had no way of knowing. What he knew was that he was alone in territory that belonged to the enemy, that he had 6 magazines left for the bar and 2 grenades, that the rain was getting worse, and that night was coming in maybe 3 hours. The ridge found him rather than the other way around. He'd been moving roughly west, trying to get back to the battalion perimeter, when the ground suddenly dropped away on his left, a sheer fall of maybe 40 feet into a ravine choked with vegetation. To his right, the ridge rose another 20 feet, a spine of volcanic rock and clay that jutted out of the jungle like a broken finger. He stopped, breathing hard, trying to think through the fog of adrenaline and fear. The ridge was narrow, maybe 10 feet across at its widest point, running roughly north-south for 100 yards before disappearing back into the jungle on both ends. Below, down in the ravine, he could just make out the shapes of larger trees, the silver gleam of water. Above, on the high ground, the jungle pressed close, but there were gaps in the canopy where he could see maybe 20 yards in any direction. It was defensible. That was the first thought. The second thought was that it was also a trap. But night was coming, and he had to be somewhere, had to make a choice, and choices in war came down to which way of dying seemed least terrible. He climbed up onto the ridge, moving slowly, checking every shadow, and found a spot where 3 trees had grown close together, their roots creating a natural hollow in the rock face. It wasn't much, maybe 3 feet deep and 6 feet wide, but it offered cover from 3 sides and a clear field of fire down the length of the ridge in both directions. He settled in, arranged the bar across a route that made a natural rest, and tried to slow his breathing, tried to think. The battalion was down there somewhere, maybe a mile away, maybe 2, down in the valley where the ridge eventually sloped to meet flatter ground. If he'd read the terrain right during the patrol, if his sense of direction hadn't been completely scrambled by the ambush, then this ridge overlooked one of the approaches to the battalion perimeter, which meant the Japanese would want it, which meant they'd come for it, probably tonight, probably in force. The smart play was to move, to get off this exposed piece of ground and disappear into the jungle, to make his way back to friendly lines alone. But something stopped him. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the Marine Corps doctrine drilled into him over months of training, the idea that you held ground, that you didn't give the enemy anything for free, that every yard they took they paid for in blood. Maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe he was just too tired to run anymore. He checked his ammunition. 6 magazines, 20 rounds each. 120 rounds total. 2 marked 2 fragmentation grenades. A K-bar knife that had belonged to his father in the First War. A compass that probably didn't work anymore after being submerged in muddy water. A half-empty canteen. No food. No morphine. No radio. The .45 pistol on his hip with 2 magazines. 14 rounds of hardball that wouldn't do much at anything past bad breath distance. He did the math in his head. If they came at him in force, if they sent even a squad, he had maybe 2 minutes of sustained fire before he was out. Less if he had to go cyclic. And then what? Fix bayonets and die on his feet? The thought made him laugh, a harsh bark that sounded wrong in the silence. The rain slackened as the light began to fail, turning from a downpour to a steady drizzle that beaded on every surface, that made the jungle look like it was wrapped in gauze. Castellano used the last of the light to improve his position, scraping away loose soil and piling rocks to build up the sides of his hollow, creating firing ports that would let him shoot while staying mostly concealed. He broke branches and wove them together with vines, creating a crude overhead cover that wouldn't stop bullets, but might break up his silhouette, might buy him a few seconds of confusion if someone was trying to locate him by muzzle flash. It was hasty fieldcraft, the kind of thing any rifleman learned in basic, but it made him feel less exposed, less like a target waiting to be hit. Darkness came fast in the jungle, dropping like a curtain, and with it came the sounds. The rain faded to nothing, leaving behind a dripping silence that was somehow worse than the storm. Insects started their nightly symphony, a rising chorus of clicks and buzzes that made it impossible to hear anything else, that would mask the sound of men moving through the undergrowth until they were right on top of you. Castellano strained his ears, trying to separate threat from nature, trying to hear the things that didn't belong. A branch breaking under a boot, the metallic clink of equipment, the whisper of cloth against bark. But there was nothing, just the insects and the dripping water and his own breathing, too loud, too fast. The first probes came around midnight. Not an attack, not yet, but scouts moving through the jungle below the ridge, testing, looking. Castellano heard them before he saw them, heard the slight change in the insect noise, the way it died in one area and continued in another, marking their passage like a shadow moving across water. He eased the bar up, sighting down into the darkness where the ridge met the jungle, and waited. 3 shapes materialized out of the black, moving slow and low, rifles at the ready. Japanese infantry, probably a recon element checking the ridge before bringing up the main force. They were good. He had to give them that. They moved like ghosts, making almost no sound, using the terrain to mask their approach. He let them come closer, his finger resting lightly on the trigger, his breathing shallow and controlled. 20 yards. 15. 10. Close enough now that he could hear them breathing, could smell the distinctive odor of their uniforms, fish oil and sweat and wet wool. The lead man stopped, tilted his head, listening. Castellano's finger tightened on the trigger. The bar roared, the muzzle flash lighting up the night like a strobe, and the lead man went down in a heap. He swung right, fired again, caught the second man trying to dive for cover. The third man got off one shot, the Arisakas cracked sharp and loud, the round whining off rock inches from Castellano's head, and then he was stitching him with fire, watching him fold and fall. 9 rounds. 3 men down. The jungle swallowed the sound and went silent. He waited, counting seconds, listening for the follow-up. Nothing came. They were being careful now, knew he was here, knew he was armed and alert. The next time they'd come with more men, with a plan, with fire support. He needed to move, to shift position, but moving meant exposing himself, meant making noise. He compromised, sliding 6 feet to his right, behind a different tree, changing his angle slightly. The bar came up again, covering the same approach. Minutes crawled past. An hour. The insects started up again, tentatively at first, then building back to their full chorus. Maybe they'd pulled back. Maybe they were waiting for dawn. Maybe they were circling, looking for a way to flank him. The attack came from the south, a sudden eruption of rifle fire and grenades that turned the ridge into hell. He'd guessed wrong, thought they'd come back the way the scouts had, but they'd learned, adapted, sent the assault element around to hit him from the opposite direction. Rounds snapped past his head, thudded into the trees behind him, chipped rock and sent splinters flying. He rolled left, came up firing, saw shapes in the muzzle flashes, maybe 6 or 8 men rushing the ridge in a line. The bar hammered, spent brass arcing into the dark, and the line broke apart, men dropping or diving for cover. He swung the barrel, looking for targets, squeezing off bursts, and something punched his shoulder hard enough to spin him halfway around. He went down, the bar falling across his lap, pain exploding through his left side. For a panicked second, he thought he'd been hit, thought he was dying, but then he realized it was just impact trauma, a round that had struck his canteen and the metal mess kit behind it. The force of it enough to bruise ribs and knock him flat, but not penetrate. He grabbed the bar, brought it back up, and kept firing, emptying the magazine into the smoke and shadows until the bolt locked back. The attackers had gone aground, were returning fire from concealed positions, and he was exposed, sitting in the open with an empty weapon. He dropped behind a largest tree, thumbed the magazine release, slapped in a fresh one, yanked the charging handle. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline and fear making everything harder. Grenades. He needed to break up their positions, force them to move or die. He grabbed one of the Mark IIs, pulled the pin, counted 2 seconds, and threw it as hard as he could toward where he thought the enemy was concentrated. The explosion lit up the night, a brief orange flash that showed him 3 men caught in the open, showed him the error in his estimate. There were more than 6. Maybe 10, maybe 15. Too many for one man with a bar and one grenade left. But they didn't know that. They didn't know he was alone. For all they knew, he was the point man for a Marine position, a fortified strongpoint with interlocking fields of fire and a company's worth of rifles. He grabbed the bar and started shooting again, deliberately now, controlled 3-round bursts, spacing them out to make it sound like multiple weapons, moving between shots to create the illusion of different firing positions. And slowly, impossibly, it worked. The return fire slackened, became sporadic, uncertain. Someone shouted orders in Japanese, harsh and urgent, and the shapes began pulling back, moving away from the ridge, disappearing into the jungle the way they'd come. He waited 20 minutes before he let himself believe they were really gone. His whole body was shaking now, trembling so badly he could barely hold the bar. He'd gone through 3 magazines in maybe 90 seconds, 60 rounds that had sounded like twice that in the echo chamber of the jungle. 3 left. 60 rounds. 1 grenade. And dawn was still hours away. The rest of the night passed in a fog of exhaustion and hypervigilance that left him feeling like he was dreaming while awake. Every sound was a threat. Every shadow was an enemy. The insects became his early warning system, their silence marking the approach of danger. Twice more they probed his position, single riflemen or pairs moving carefully through the darkness, testing his defenses, trying to locate him precisely. He didn't fire, didn't give away his position, just watched them through the gloom and prayed they'd move on. They did, eventually, but he knew they were still out there, knew they were planning something for when the sun came up. Dawn broke gray and miserable, the rain returning with the light, and with it came a new kind of terror. In daylight, his position was fully exposed. From a jungle below, a trained marksman would have a clear shot at his hollow. From above, on the high ground, someone with patience and a good eye could put rounds right into his lap. He needed to move, but moving in daylight was suicide. He compromised again, using the rain as cover, sliding deeper into his hollow until he was pressed against the rock face. The bar angled awkwardly across the roots, his body contorted into a shape that made his legs scream within minutes. The shelling started an hour after dawn. Not artillery, they didn't have big guns this far forward, but knee mortars, the Type 89 grenade dischargers that Japanese infantry carried at the squad level. The rounds came in with their distinctive hollow pop, arcing high before dropping almost vertically, detonating an airburst that sent shrapnel scything through the trees. The first one hit 50 yards away, too far to do more than make him flinch. The second was closer, maybe 30 yards, shredding foliage and sending up a plume of mud and smoke. They were walking them in, adjusting fire, looking for the range. The third round hit the ridge 10 yards from his position, the blast wave slamming into his hollow like a giant fist, filling the air with dirt and rock fragments that stung like hornets. He curled into a ball, arms over his head, the bar trapped beneath him, and prayed. The mortars kept coming, a steady rhythm of pop-weight crump, turning the ridge into a moonscape. Shrapnel whined overhead, clattered off rock, thudded into wood. One fragment sliced through his left pant leg, laying open a shallow cut from knee to ankle that burned like fire. He couldn't return fire, couldn't even see where the mortars were being fired from, could only endure and hope that random chance or divine intervention would keep him breathing. The barrage went on for 10 minutes that felt like 10 hours, and when it finally stopped, his ears were bleeding and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. The infantry came during the silence after the mortars, using the smoke and dust as cover. He saw them through gaps in the haze, moving fast and low, coming from the north and south simultaneously, trying to catch him in a pincer. Maybe 20 men total, a full platoon, moving with the confidence of soldiers who thought they were assaulting a corpse. Castellano forced himself up, forced his trembling hands to grip the bar, forced his eyes to focus through the tears and the ringing in his skull. He picked a target, the lead man from the northern group, and squeezed the trigger. Nothing happened. Jum, his brain screamed the word even as his hands moved automatically, yanking back the charging handle, clearing the chamber, seeing the mangled cartridge that had failed to feed properly, probably damaged by the mortar blast, probably his own fault for not checking the magazine after being knocked around. The enemy was 50 yards away and closing fast. 40 yards. He stripped the magazine out, slammed in his second-to-last one, pulled the charging handle, aimed and fired. The bar came alive again, that beautiful, terrible roar, and men started falling. But there were too many. Even as he cut down the leaders, the others kept coming, spreading out, using fire and maneuver the way their own doctrine taught them, one group suppressing while another advanced. He was going to die here. The thought came with a strange clarity, almost peaceful, a simple acknowledgement of mathematical reality. One man with 60 rounds couldn't stop 20 men who knew what they were doing. But he could make them pay. He could make every yard of this godforsaken ridge cost them blood. That was something. That was enough. He shifted fire to the southern group, caught 2 men in the open, watched them go down in a tangle of limbs. Shifted back north, fired at muzzle flashes, heard the distinctive thwack of rounds hitting flesh even if he couldn't see the targets through the smoke. The bar's barrel was getting hot now, the wood furniture scorching his left hand where he gripped the stock. And then, like a miracle he didn't deserve and couldn't explain, they broke. First one man, then another, pulling back, running, disappearing into the jungle. The others followed, some firing as they retreated, others just running, and within seconds the ridge was empty except for the bodies and the smoke and the rain that had started again, washing away the blood, washing away the evidence that any of this had happened. Castellano slumped against the rock, the bar across his knees, and tried to understand what had just occurred. Had he killed that many? Had they run out of ammunition? Had they received orders to pull back? Or had they simply decided that taking this ridge wasn't worth the cost? He didn't know, didn't care. He was alive, and that was more than he'd expected 5 minutes ago. He checked the bar, cleared the action, inspected the barrel for damage. It was scorching hot, the finish burned off in patches, but it was functional. 1 magazine left, 20 rounds. The last grenade. His shoulder was one massive bruise where the canteen had taken a round. His leg was bleeding through his trousers. His hands are shaking so badly he could barely hold a cigarette when he tried to light one, the match flickering out in the rain before he gave up and threw the whole pack away. The day crawled past with the aching slowness of fever. He couldn't sleep, couldn't rest, could only watch the jungle and wait for the next attack that he knew would come. Around noon, he heard engines, distant but getting closer, the low rumble of vehicles moving along the valley floor. American vehicles. Had to be. The Japanese didn't have that kind of motorized transport this far forward. Not anymore, not after the Air Corps had spent weeks destroying everything on wheels. Which meant the battalion was down there, maybe regrouping, maybe advancing, maybe consolidating their line. Which meant this ridge really did matter, really was a key piece of terrain that overlooked their position. Which meant he'd been right to stay, right to fight, even if it killed him. He tried to signal them, waving his utility jacket above the ridge, but if anyone saw him, they didn't respond. The engines faded into the distance. The jungle settled back into its waiting silence. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, a hollow ache that had moved past pain into something almost abstract, just another discomfort to add to the collection. Thirst was worse. His canteen was empty, destroyed by the round that should have killed him, and he had no way to collect the rain that fell in sheets. He tried catching in his helmet, but the helmet had a hole in it he hadn't noticed, probably shrapnel, and the water leaked out as fast as it came in. He scraped water off leaves with his fingers, licked it off his hands, drank from puddles that tasted like rotten soil, and probably contained enough parasites to kill him in a few weeks if bullets didn't finish the job first. The second night was worse than the first because he knew what was coming. They'd learned his position now, understood his capabilities, knew he was alone, or nearly so. They'd come with more men, with better tactics, with the patience to surround him and wear him down until his ammunition ran out, and then finish him with bayonets. He considered abandoning the ridge, slipping away in the darkness, trying to make it back to American lines. But his legs wouldn't support him anymore, were cramping and weak from nearly 40 hours of tension and terror, and moving in the dark through enemy-controlled jungle was a death sentence. At least here, he had cover, had a field of fire, had a chance. The infiltration started around 2,200 hours. He heard them coming, heard the insects go silent in a spreading wave, marking their approach from 3 directions. They were being even more careful now, moving individually or in pairs, trying to get close before rushing them all at once. He counted positions in his head, trying to map their locations by sound and by the gaps in the insect chorus. 1 pair to the north, maybe 30 yards out. 3 men to the south, closer, maybe 20 yards. And at least 2 more coming from above, from the high ground, the most dangerous approach, because he couldn't cover it without exposing himself completely. He made a decision. The grenade. His last one. He'd save it for when they rushed, throw it into the largest group, hope the blast and confusion would give him a few seconds to change magazines and get the bar back in action. Until then, he'd hold fire, let them think he was asleep or dead or stupid, let them get close enough that he couldn't miss. His hands found the grenade, pulled it close, felt the cold metal against his palm. 20 rounds in the bar, 14 in the .45, 34 rounds total between him and whatever came next. They came at 0, 300, a coordinated rush from all 3 directions, screaming to terrify him or to pump up their own courage, or maybe just because that's what soldiers do when they're running toward death. Castellano grabbed the grenade, pulled the pin, cooked it for 2 seconds, and threw it toward the southern group, the ones who were closest. He didn't wait to see the result, just grabbed the bar and opened up on the northern pair, catching them in the open, watching them stumble and fall. The grenade detonated behind him, the blast wave shoving him forward against the tree, and the screaming changed pitch became anguished. He swung the bar around, fired at the men coming from above, saw one go down, lost the other in the smoke. And then they were on top of him, inside his perimeter, too close for the bar. He dropped it, clawed for the .45, brought it up, and shot a man in the face at a distance of maybe 6 feet. The recoil kicked the pistol up, and he brought it back down, shot another man in the chest, watched him fold. A rifle, but caught him the ribs, drove the air from his lungs, and he went down hard, the pistol flying from his hand. He grabbed his K-bar, the blade coming free of its sheath with a rasp, and drove it into the nearest body he could reach. Hot blood splashed across his face. Someone was screaming, high and terrible. Someone else was cursing in Japanese, the words meaningless but the rage universal. He rolled, came up swinging, the knife connecting with something soft, and then a rifle barrel cracked across his skull, and the world went white and distant. He was on his back, looking up at the rain, and a face loomed over him, a Japanese soldier with his rifle raised for the killing stroke, bayonet fixed, and Castellano thought, this is it, this is how it ends, thought of his mother in Philadelphia, thought of the girl he'd kissed before shipping out, thought of all the things he'd never do, and then the soldier's head exploded in a spray of red, and he dropped like a puppet with cut strings. More shots, close and loud, the crack of M1 Garand's and the heavier bark of Springfield's. American voices, shouting, calling for medics, calling for him. Flashlights cutting through the darkness. Hands grabbing him, lifting him, and he tried to fight, couldn't tell friend from enemy anymore, couldn't tell if he was alive or dead or dreaming. Someone was saying his name, saying, Castellano, Jimmy, you're okay, you're safe, we got you. And he wanted to believe it but couldn't, wanted to trust it but didn't. They carried him off the ridge on a stretcher for Marines he didn't recognize, and as they descended into the valley, he looked back and saw what he'd held for 48 hours. Saw the bodies scattered across the ridge, counted 12, 15, maybe 20, hard to tell in the darkness. Saw the crater where the mortar barrage had torn up the earth. Saw the hollow where he'd fought and bled and nearly died. The trees splintered and torn, the ground carpeted with spent brass that gleamed dully in the flashlight beams. It looked like a battlefield. It looked like the place where something important had happened. It looked like nothing, just another piece of jungle ridge indistinguishable from 10,000 others. The battalion aid station was a tent in a clearing, lit by Coleman lanterns that cast hard shadows and made everyone look like ghosts. A corpsman cut away his utilities, cleaned his wounds, bandaged his leg and his head and the dozen other cuts and scrapes he hadn't even noticed. Nothing serious, the corpsman said. No major trauma. Just exhaustion and dehydration and the general accumulated damage of being a Marine in the Pacific. He'd be back with his unit in a week, maybe less. Lucky, the corpsman said. Real lucky. Castellano didn't feel lucky. He felt hollow, emptied out, like something essential had been scooped out of his chest and couldn't be replaced. He couldn't stop shaking. Couldn't stop seeing the faces of the men he'd killed. Couldn't stop hearing the mortars. Couldn't stop feeling the rifle but crack across his ribs. The battalion exec came by at dawn, a major he'd never spoken to, and told him he'd held a vital piece of terrain against overwhelming enemy force. That his actions had protected the battalion's flank, that there would be a commendation, probably a Bronze Star, maybe more. Castellano nodded and said nothing because there was nothing to say. He hadn't held the ridge for the battalion, or for the Corps, or for America. He'd held it because leaving felt like dying and staying felt like living, and in the end, that was the only choice that mattered. They asked him later, after the war, after he'd come home to Philadelphia and try to be normal again, try to work a regular job and date regular girls and pretend that the jungle didn't follow him everywhere he went. They asked him if he'd been scared, if he'd thought about running, if he'd known how many enemy soldiers he'd killed. He told them yes. He'd been scared every second of those 48 hours. Yes, he'd thought about running 100 times. No, he didn't know how many men he'd killed and didn't want to know. They asked if he felt like a hero. He laughed at that, a harsh sound that made his wife look at him funny. Heroes were something you read about in the paper, something you saw in newsreels, something that happened to other people who did extraordinary things. What he'd done wasn't extraordinary. It was just survival. It was just doing what needed doing because there was no one else to do it. But late at night, when the dreams came and the jungle grew close again in the darkness of his bedroom, when he could smell the cordite in the rain and the rotting earth, when he could feel the bar bucking against his shoulder and hear the mortars walking in and see the faces of the men he'd killed frozen forever in their final seconds, he understood that the ridge had never let him go. That those 48 hours had marked him in ways that no medal could commemorate, had changed something fundamental about who he was and who he would be for the rest of his life. He'd learned what he was capable of when pushed beyond all reasonable limits. He'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. He'd learned that loneliness was its own kind of death, and that survival sometimes meant doing things you couldn't let yourself think about afterward. The ridge existed on no official maps. The battle was never written up in any after-action report. The bodies were buried in mass graves that would be forgotten within a year, covered by jungle that grew back with the indifferent hunger of nature reclaiming what men had briefly stolen. James Castellano received his Bronze Star in a ceremony at Camp Pendleton 3 months later, pinned it to his dress blues, and never wore it again. He carried the story with him for 63 more years, shared it with exactly 3 people, and died in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in 2007 with the rain tapping at his window and the sound of distant thunder that might have been mortars or might have been just the weather. The men who found him on that ridge at dawn in October 1944 told the story differently, told it the way all war stories get told, with embellishment and simplification and the slow accretion of myth that turns complicated truths into clean narratives. In their version, he'd held off 100 enemy soldiers. In their version, he'd never wavered, never doubted, never came within seconds of having his head split by a bayonet. In their version, he was a hero, clear and simple. And maybe that was true in its own way, true the way all stories are true when they capture something essential about the human capacity for endurance in the face of annihilation. But the truth, the complicated, uncomfortable truth, was that he'd been terrified and lucky and stubborn and desperate, that he'd fought because not fighting meant dying, that he'd killed because being killed was unacceptable, that he'd held the ridge not through courage, but through the mechanical repetition of training and instinct and the simple animal refusal to surrender when surrender meant extinction. The truth was that war made heroes out of men who were just trying not to die, that survival was its own kind of victory, that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was stay awake one more hour, fire one more round, Endure one more mortar barrage when every fiber of your being was screaming to run or hide or simply give up. The ridge stood empty now, reclaimed by the jungle. The bones long since scattered or rotted, the brass tarnished and buried, the scars healed over by generations of new growth. But for one man, for 48 hours in October 1944, it had been the entire world, had been the line between life and death, had been a piece of ground that mattered absolutely because holding it meant living and losing it meant dying. And in that space, in that crucible of isolation and fear and violence, something had been forged that would echo through the decades, would shape a life in ways both visible and invisible, would remain long after the metals tarnished and the memories faded and the jungle swallowed every trace that any of it had ever happened. The rain still falls on that ridge. The insects still sing their nightly chorus. And sometimes, on certain nights when the wind is right and the jungle holds its breath, you can almost hear the echo of automatic weapons fire, almost smell the cordite in the rain, almost see the muzzle flashes that lit up the darkness when one Marine held the line alone and refused to break. Almost, but not quite, because some things can never be fully told or understood by those who weren't there, who didn't feel the weight of that rifle or taste that fear or make those impossible choices when every option led to death except the one that led through death towards something that might, if you were very lucky and very stubborn and very desperate, resemble survival. The ridge remembers, even if no one else does.